Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine the smell, not the smell of something romantic, not wood smoke and pine. I mean the real smell of a southern Alabama night in 1887, wet red clay, rotting cotton stalks, the thick animal stench of pig pens somewhere close. And underneath all of it, something older, heavier, harder to name, the smell of decades of suffering pressed into the soil itself. Now open your eyes, because you're standing at the edge of a cotton field at midnight, and the torchlight ahead of you is throwing long shadows across a yard of packed dirt. And in the center of that yard, there is an old woman. She's kneeling in the mud, not by choice. A man in a black suit is standing over her. He's younger than you'd expect for someone who carries this much cruelty. Clean, shaven, polished boots that cost more than anything that woman has ever owned. And he is kicking dirt into her face, slowly, deliberately, like he has all the time in the world. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't even close her eyes. She just kneels there in that mud, and she takes it. And that stillness, that absolute iron stillness, is what makes him angrier. He raises his boot again. And then the howl comes, long pause, deep, guttural, so close that every man in that yard feels it in his chest before he hears it with his ears. The kind of sound that doesn't just frighten you. The kind of sound that reaches back into something ancient in your brain, something that lived before language, before civilization, and reminds you that you are small, that you are prey. The man in the black suit goes very still. At the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, two eyes open in the dark. Gold, burning gold, watching, and the old woman looks up at those eyes and she whispers two words, just two words. My son. Music begins, low, mournful. Now, her son had been dead for 15 years. Everyone on that plantation knew it. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was where his spirit had gone, or what it had become, or why, on this particular night, it had come back. That is the story I want to tell you today, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you will never forget it. Her name was Alma. She was 63 years old. Her back was permanently curved from decades of picking cotton, bent at an angle that would have looked painful on anyone else, but had simply become the shape of her body, the shape that labor had carved her into over a lifetime. Her hands were twisted like old tree roots, the knuckles swollen, the fingers slightly crooked. She walked with a limp that got worse in cold weather, and in Alabama in the winter, the cold got into her joints the way it gets into old houses. Not dramatic, not sudden, just constant and patient. And everywhere, she had been born on this land, not nearby, not in the county, on this specific piece of land. The Thornhill Plantation, 200 acres of cotton fields, 12 miles outside Montgomery. A main house with white columns that you could see from a long way off, gleaming in the sun, the way things gleam when they are built on someone else's suffering. And those slave quarters, Lord, you have to understand what those looked like. Wooden shacks that leaked when it rained. Dirt floors, straw piles that passed for beds. You could see your own breath in there on winter mornings. 3 or 4 people crowded into a space the size of a large closet. That was where Alma had spent the majority of her 63 years on this earth. You see, the Civil War had ended, emancipation had come, Reconstruction had happened and then fallen apart. It was 1887, 2 years after the war, and 17 enslaved people still worked the Thornhill Plantation. Not because slavery was legal, it wasn't. They stayed because James Thornhill owned everything for miles. They stayed because leaving meant traveling through territory where men who looked like him would stop them, question them, arrest them on invented charges. They stayed because 3 people who had tried to leave had been found hanging from trees. They stayed because sometimes the cage you know is less terrifying than the wilderness you don't. James Thornhill was 35 years old. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had built it on the backs of people like Alma. James believed genuinely, deeply, in his bones believed, that this was the natural order of things, that God had organized the world this way on purpose. When emancipation came, his father had laughed. When Reconstruction ended, his father had celebrated. And now James ran things the exact same way, with fear, with violence, with total and absolute control. He was the kind of man who could look a 63-year-old woman in the eyes and see nothing, not a person, not a history, nothing that mattered. But here is the thing about Alma that you need to understand before we go any further. She had survived things that would have destroyed most people. She had watched her mother die in childbirth on that dirt floor when Alma was 6 years old. She had picked cotton in that field since she was five years old, small enough that the stalks were almost as tall as she was, fingers bleeding by the end of the first day, fingers aching by the end of the first week, fingers eventually becoming something hardened and calloused and broken in a way that never fully healed. She had buried 3 children before they turned 10. Think about that for a second. 3 children. 3 small graves she had dug with her own hands in the ground behind the slave quarters. Only one had survived to adulthood. His name was Thomas, and here is where this story changes, because Thomas was not ordinary. Thomas was extraordinary in ways that made his life on the Thornhill Plantation a dangerous thing to be. He was tall, broad-shouldered, quick with numbers in a way that seemed almost magical. He could calculate the weight of a cotton harvest faster than James Thornhill's overseer could do it on paper. He had a memory like a steel trap, and he could read. Now, reading was forbidden. Completely, absolutely forbidden. Teaching an enslaved person to read was a crime. Learning to read was grounds for brutal punishment. But Alma had taught him anyway, in secret, late at night, crouched over a Bible she had stolen from the main house, holding a candle stub low so the light wouldn't show under the door. She had taught her son to read because she understood, even in the middle of her own suffering, that knowledge was the one thing they could never fully take from you. Thomas had been 19 years old when he disappeared. One day he was working in the fields, carrying water to the other workers under the August sun, moving between the rows of cotton with that easy, long-legged stride of his. He had smiled at Alma that morning. That's the last clear memory she had of him, that smile, easy and warm and young, the smile of someone who hadn't yet stopped hoping. The next morning he was gone. James Thornhill's father said Thomas had run away, packed up in the night and left. He said it with a confidence that should have been suspicious, a smoothness that should have raised questions. But nobody asked questions, because asking questions meant ending up like Thomas, wherever Thomas was. Alma found blood on the barn floor 3 days later, a dark stain in the dirt, partially covered with fresh hay, as if someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. She stood over that stain for a long time. She didn't cry. She had already used up all the easy tears years ago. She just stood there, and she understood. They had killed her son. They had killed him and called it running away, and no one would ever be held to account for it. No law, no court, no justice of any kind. But something happened after Thomas vanished. Something that the people on that plantation would talk about in whispers for the rest of their lives. A wolf appeared near the property. Now, this is where it gets strange, and I need you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to tell you isn't something I can explain. I can only tell you what happened. The wolf was massive, bigger than any wolf anyone in that region had ever seen or heard of, taller than a grown man's waist, black fur so dark it seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it. And its eyes, gold, burning gold, intelligent in a way that animal eyes are not supposed to be intelligent. It was seen near the plantation at night, always at night, always at the edges, at the tree line, at the border of the cotton fields, at the far corner of the barn. Watching, here is what it did not do. It never came near the slave quarters, never approached the people who lived and worked on that land. Not once, in years of sightings, not one of the 17 enslaved people on the Thornhill Plantation ever felt threatened by the wolf. If anything, several of them would later say that when the wolf was near, they felt something else entirely. Something they struggled to put words to, safety maybe, or presence, the feeling of being seen, but here is what it did do. Over the course of several years, 3 overseers died, found in the morning, mauled, torn apart with a violence that was almost impossible to comprehend. The first was a man named Burke, found near the edge of the east field. The second was a man named Calloway, found behind the barn. The third was a hired hunter that James Thornhill had brought in specifically to catch the wolf, found the next morning in pieces near the tree line. James Thornhill doubled the night patrols. He set traps, steel traps, rope traps, pit traps. He hired more hunters. He posted armed men at the perimeter every night for 3 months. The wolf was never caught. It was barely even clearly seen. Just shadows. Just those gold eyes in the dark. Just howls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alma believed her son's spirit lived in that wolf. The other people on the plantation thought she was crazy from grief. And maybe she was, but she felt it. Every time the wolf appeared, she felt Thomas near her. She felt watched in a way that wasn't frightening, in a way that felt like love. She had been carrying that belief for 15 years when the day came that would finally prove her right. The day started the way every day started, before dawn, her body screaming when she stood up. You see, there is a specific kind of pain that comes from a life of physical labor on a body that was never given the chance to rest and recover properly. It is not the clean, sharp pain of an injury. It is diffuse and constant and bone, deep, the kind of pain that you can't pinpoint because it comes from everywhere at once. Every joint, every muscle, the small of your back, your hips, your shoulders. Alma experienced this every single morning when she rose from that straw pile in the pre-dawn dark, and she experienced it because there was no alternative to experiencing it. You get up, you keep going, you survive. She drew water from the well, her hands shook, the bucket was heavy. She spilled half of it. She went to the main house kitchen to help the cook, a woman named Ruth, peel potatoes and wash dishes. Simple work, the kind of work you give to someone when you've decided they're too old and broken for anything else. But even that hurt. Her hands cramped around the knife. She cut her thumb. Blood dripped onto the potato. Ruth told her to be careful, not to bleed on his food, and then James Thornhill walked in. He stood in the doorway in his black suit, his hair slicked back, his boots polished to a shine that felt like an insult in that kitchen. He looked at Alma the way you look at something you're trying to decide whether to throw away. Why is she still working in here? He asked Ruth, not Alma, Ruth, as if Alma wasn't standing right there, as if she didn't have ears, as if she wasn't a person. Ruth said Alma helped where she could. She does nothing, Thornhill said. Look at her, she can barely hold a knife. Alma kept her eyes down. She had learned long ago not to look men like this in the eye. That was seen as defiance. Defiance meant beatings. I can work, master, she said quietly. He looked at her with something beyond contempt. Something flatter and more final than contempt. You are a waste of space, he said, a waste of food. You should have died years ago. He sent her to feed the pigs. She walked out of that kitchen and across the yard, and she did not let herself feel it. Not yet. You learn over 63 years. How to put the hurt somewhere it can't reach you while your body keeps moving. You put it in a place inside yourself, and you lock the door, and you keep walking. She fed the pigs. She stood at the fence and watched those animals push each other at the trough, and she had a thought, a quiet, heartbreaking thought, that these animals lived better than she did. They were fed. They had a purpose. When they died, it would be fast. And that is when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. Angry voices from behind the barn. She moved closer, not to eavesdrop. She was too tired for strategy. She just moved toward the sound, the way exhausted people sometimes drift toward noise. It was James Thornhill and one of his overseers, a young man named Porter. 3 chickens had been killed in the night, not eaten, just killed. Something had gotten into the coop and killed them and left them there. Could be that wolf, Porter said. Silence, that damn wolf, Thornhill said slowly, like he was tasting the words. Like the wolf had become something personal to him. A wound to his pride, more than a practical problem. Double the patrols tonight. I want men with rifles. If that wolf comes back, I want it dead. And then, check the slave quarters. Make sure none of them are feeding it. Make sure none of them are protecting it. You think they would? Porter asked. I think they're animals too, Thornhill said, and animals stick together. Alma moved away before they saw her. Her heart was pounding in a way it hadn't pounded in years. The wolf had been here last night, close. Right here on the property, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt Thomas near. She went through the rest of the day in a kind of focused calm. She mended a torn dress. She scrubbed the main house floors on her aching knees. She ate her evening meal, cornmeal mush, a thumb-sized piece of salt pork, water, in near silence with the others. Ruth sat next to her and whispered a warning. Thornhill had been talking about clearing out the old workers, making room, and the way he did it was a trick as old as the plantation itself. Lure people in with the promise of wages, then never pay, then have them arrested for theft when they tried to leave. The sheriff was his cousin. It always worked. It doesn't matter, Alma said. I'll die here anyway. Just like everyone else. Ruth said nothing, because she knew it was true. Alma lay down on her straw pile that night. The other women were already asleep. She could hear rats in the walls. She closed her eyes, and then the howl came. A long, low, mournful, like a song being sung in a language older than words. Alma sat up. The other women stirred, but didn't wake. She stood, her body protesting every inch of the movement, and she walked to the door, and she opened it. The night was cold and full of stars. The moon was almost full, throwing silver light across the dead cotton fields. The plantation was quiet, except for the distant sound of the night patrol's boots on the dirt road. Another howl, closer. She walked toward it. Her feet were bare. The ground was cold and muddy. She passed the pig pen. The pigs were agitated, squealing and running in circles, and she reached the edge of the cotton fields. And there it was. It stepped out of the darkness into the moonlight, the way something steps out of a dream, slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Bigger than any wolf she had ever seen, taller than her waist, fur so black it looked like a hole cut in the night. Steam rising from its mouth in the cold air. Its eyes were gold. Alma stood still. She was not afraid. She had never, not once in 15 years, been afraid of this wolf. It was the most important thing she knew about herself, that when everyone else felt fear, she felt recognition. Thomas, she whispered. The wolf stared at her, and those eyes, those gold, burning eyes, were not the eyes of an animal. They were aware, they were present, they were full of something that she could only call recognition in return. Tears ran down her face for the first time in years, tears she had thought she didn't have left. Is it really you?" She asked the darkness. The wolf took a step toward her, then another. It was 10 feet away, 5. She could smell it, wild and earthy and real. She could hear it breathing. "They killed you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They killed you and they lied about it, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save you." The wolf lowered its head. A sound came from its throat, not a growl, something softer. Something that broke her heart open in the best possible way. She reached out her hand, trembling, ancient and twisted and scarred. And she touched it. Its fur was warm, real, solid. "My son," she wept, "my boy." And then the gunshot exploded in the night. The bullet hit the ground near the wolf. Dirt sprayed up. The wolf bolted, gone into the darkness in seconds, silent as smoke. James Thornhill came running with a rifle, Porter behind him with a torch. His face was red, his eyes wild. He had seen it. He had seen the woman kneeling with the wolf. He grabbed Alma by the arm, shook her until her teeth rattled, accused her of feeding it, of calling it, of being in league with an animal that had killed his men. She said no, master. She said no as calmly as she could. He threw her to the ground. She hit hard. Her shoulder made a sound that was terrible and final, the sound of something giving way. Pain shot through her entire body. She coughed. Blood came up, dark and frightening. He kicked her in the ribs. Porter said, "Master Thornhill," and Thornhill pointed the rifle at Alma's head. "Maybe I should just end this now," he said. "And here is the moment that I think about most when I think about this story." Because Alma looked up at him, looked up from the mud, with blood on her lips and her shoulder destroyed and her body giving out, and she said the one thing in the world that he wasn't expecting. "Do it, not desperate, not pleading, calm, final, do it, I'm ready." That surprised him enough to make him pause. And in that pause, whatever he was, whatever cruelty lived at the center of him, decided that death was too easy. "Lock her in the cellar," he told Porter. "No food, no water, 3 days. Porter hesitated, said she was old, said she might not survive. "Then she dies," Thornhill said. "I don't care." They dragged her across the plantation. There was a cellar beneath the barn, a hole in the ground, completely dark, smelling of mold and old death. They threw her down the stairs. The door slammed shut above her. A lock clicked. Darkness, complete and total and absolute. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not just the darkness on top of everything else. On top of 63 years, on top of 3 children in the ground, on top of Thomas, on top of a morning that had started with a man telling her she should have died years ago. On top of a shoulder that was badly injured and ribs that were probably cracked and blood on her lips. On top of all of that, darkness, complete and total and absolute. Thirst came first, then hunger, then the cold that seeped into her bones through the dirt floor. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Her mind showed her Thomas as a child, his voice, his hand in hers. She would wake and remember, but she stayed alive. She felt along the walls in the dark and found a shelf, and found on that shelf a small tin cup with maybe 4 ounces of old, stagnant water in it. She drank every drop without hesitation. She stayed alive. She heard Ruth's voice above her, through the floor, on the second day. "She's going to die." And Porter, "Maybe that's the point." And Ruth, quiet and hard, "It's murder." She stayed alive. Because, in the darkness, she had understood something. Thomas had not come back just to protect her. He had come back for something larger, for everyone who had ever suffered on this land, for the generations of people whose blood was in that soil. And if she died in this hole, what would happen to him? Would he be free? Or would he be trapped here forever, haunting this place with nothing to watch over? She had to survive, not for herself, For him, on the second night, she heard it again, the howl, close, right above her, and then scratching, frantic, desperate scratching on the cellar door. The wolf was trying to get in, trying to reach her. The door was thick, the lock was solid. But the sound of it, the sound of something fighting to get to her, broke through the numbness and the pain and reached her somewhere deep. And then the screaming started, gunshots, shouting, chaos above her in the yard, something heavy hitting the ground. A human scream, wet and short, more shots, more shouting, and then James Thornhill's voice above everything else. Get inside the house. Everyone inside, doors slamming, silence. Then, hours later, the cellar door opened. Light poured in, and she covered her eyes, because after 3 days in perfect darkness, even lamplight was blinding. James Thornhill stood at the top of the stairs. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. She had never seen his hands shake before. Get up, he said. She couldn't. Her legs wouldn't obey. He came down and dragged her up by the hair, pulled her across the yard into the torchlight, and she saw what had happened while she was underground. Bodies, 2 of them, torn apart, blood that had turned black in the night air, soaking into the dirt. One was Silas, the overseer who had mocked her at the pig pen, who had talked about putting her down like an old dog. His throat was ripped out. His eyes stared at nothing. The other was a hired gun she didn't recognize. Your wolf did this, Thornhill said. He threw her to the ground for the second time. 2 of my men dead because of that animal. And you called it here, she said she hadn't. He pulled out a pistol and aimed it at her head. And again she said, do it. He didn't. Instead, and this was the most monstrous thing he had done yet, more monstrous even than the cellar, he decided to use her. Tie her to the whipping post, he told Porter. The wolf wants her, so we'll give it what it wants. And when it comes to her, we'll kill it. The whipping post. I need to tell you about the whipping post. It stood in the center of the plantation yard, a thick wooden pole driven deep into the earth. Dark stains covered it, stains that you could see even in the torchlight, stains that had been there so long they had become part of the wood itself. The blood of generations. Porter carried Alma to it. She weighed almost nothing now, 3 days without food or water, and he tied her wrists high on the post, so high that her feet barely touched the ground, all her weight hanging from her already destroyed shoulder. I'm sorry, he whispered as he tied the ropes. She said nothing. Thornhill positioned his men around the yard. 6 of them, all armed, all pointed toward the tree line. He stood near the main house porch with his rifle, waiting, and Alma hung there, her consciousness drifting in and out. The pain so total now that it had gone somewhere beyond pain, into a kind of floating distance, like her mind was gently separating from her body to protect itself. She thought about her mother, her children, Thomas. She thought about this land, 200 acres soaked in blood, in pain, in generations of injustice. And she thought that maybe this was why Thomas had not moved on, not just for her, for all of them, for every soul that had ever been broken here. The moon reached its highest point in the sky. Silver light flooded the yard. And then the howl came, long, low, from the direction of the woods. The men tensed. Rifles came up. Another howl, closer, movement in the shadows at the edge of the torchlight, something massive circling, staying just beyond the reach of the fire. Thornhill's men saw its shape, and she heard one of them, a grown man, say in a voice that cracked with fear, I see it. Hold your fire, Thornhill said. Wait until it comes into the light. The wolf stepped forward, enormous, powerful, moving like liquid shadow. It stopped at the edge of the torchlight, and its gold eyes found Alma, and she felt it again, that feeling of being utterly seen, utterly known. And then those eyes shifted to James Thornhill. What was in them in that moment was not animal. It was not instinct or hunger or fear. It was hate. Old, patient, certain hate. Now, Thornhill screamed. 6 rifles fired. The sound was deafening. Smoke filled the yard. The wolf moved faster than anything that size had any right to move. Left, right, through the smoke. 3 bullets missed. 2 hit its flank. 1 grazed its head. Blood on black fur. It didn't stop. It charged. What happened in the next 60 seconds was chaos. The wolf hit the first man, and he flew backward, his rifle clattering across the dirt. It moved between the others before they could reload. A blur of black fur and fury. Another man down. Then another. Screams in the night. Shots going everywhere. James Thornhill ran for the main house. He reached the porch, and the wolf cut him off. They faced each other, man and something that had once been a man. Thornhill raised his rifle. His hands shook so badly he could barely aim. The wolf's lips pulled back, revealing teeth dark with blood. He fired. The bullet hit the wolf in the chest. The wolf stumbled, fell, lay still. Thornhill laughed. A high, terrible, hysterical laugh. "Got you," he said. "I got you." He walked toward the body with his rifle pointed down, ready to finish it. He was going to make sure. He was going to be certain. The wolf's eyes opened. It rose up fast, faster than should have been possible, with a bullet in its chest. And Thornhill had no time. No time to aim, no time to run, no time to do anything at all. The wolf's jaws closed around his throat. The sound lasted only a moment, then silence. James Thornhill was dead before he hit the ground. Alma watched all of it from the whipping post. And she felt no horror, no fear. What she felt was something she hadn't felt since Thomas was alive. She felt like justice had finally come. Like the universe had, after 63 years, corrected something. The wolf limped toward her, slowly. The bullet wounds were serious. It was bleeding, breathing hard, weakening. But it came until it stood in front of her, those gold eyes looking up into her face. "You came back," she whispered. "You came back for me." The wolf made a sound somewhere between a whimper and something so much sadder than a growl, and pressed its head against her legs. She felt its warmth, its breath. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry they killed you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you the way you protected me." Tears ran down her face in rivers. "You can rest now. It's over. He's dead. You can rest." The wolf looked up at her one last time, gold eyes, her son's eyes, full of something that she would later struggle to describe and eventually settle on the simplest word: love. Then it walked away, slowly, painfully, back toward the darkness at the edge of the fields, back toward the woods. Back toward wherever it came from. She watched it go until she couldn't see it anymore. "Goodbye, my son," she whispered. Goodbye. She never saw it again. Ruth came running. The other 16 enslaved people followed behind her, coming out of the slave quarters where they had watched everything from the windows and doorways. Someone cut the ropes. Alma fell, and Ruth caught her and lowered her gently to the ground. "You're going to be okay," Ruth said. They both knew it wasn't true. Alma's body had been pushed past what a body can survive. 3 days in the cellar. The beatings hung from the whipping post. She had minutes left. They could all see it. "The wolf," Alma whispered. "Did you see it?" "Yes," Ruth said. "We all saw it. That was Thomas. That was my son." Ruth nodded. She didn't argue. "I know," she said. "We all know." Alma's eyes closed. Her breathing went shallow. And then, there in the mud of the Thornhill Plantation yard, surrounded by the people she had lived alongside for 63 years, Alma died. She was finally free. Ruth held her body for a long time. The plantation was silent. The torches were dying one by one. James Thornhill's body lay in the yard, and no one touched it. Finally, Ruth looked up. Her face was wet. Her eyes were hard. "We bury our dead," she said, "and then we burn this place to the ground." They worked through the night. They dug Alma's grave behind the slave quarters, deep and respectful. They wrapped her in the best blanket they could find. They laid her to rest as the sun began to rise. Ruth stood over the grave and said the words she knew. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Then they turned and they looked at the plantation, the main house with its white columns, the barn, the cotton fields, the whipping post still standing in the yard, its ropes hanging loose. They grabbed torches. They lit fires in every building. The main house went up fast, old wood, very dry, flames climbing the walls, windows exploding outward, the roof collapsing inward with a sound like a thunderclap. The barn went next, the overseer houses, the storage sheds, the cotton gin. The 17 people who had lived as property on this land stood and watched it all burn. Some smiled, some cried, some just stood in silence, watching 200 years of suffering turn to ash. James Thornhill's body stayed in the yard. Let him burn with his plantation. Let him turn to ash with everything he had built on suffering. By noon, the fires had died, charred ruins, nothing left. Before they left, before they walked down that road that led away from the property, the road they had never been allowed to take, Ruth went back to Alma's grave. She knelt in the dirt. She placed her hand on the earth. "Thank you," she whispered, "for holding on, for surviving, for giving us this chance." The wind moved through the dead cotton fields. It carried smoke and ash. And Ruth thought she heard, she was never fully certain, but she thought she heard a howl, distant, fading, like a final goodbye. She wiped her eyes. She stood. She walked back to the others. All 17 of them walked down that road together into the morning sun. Ruth lived to be 83 years old. She settled in a free community 4 days' walk from the Thornhill Plantation. She married, she had children. She watched them go to school, something her mother had never seen, something Alma had never seen, and then watched their children go to school, and then their children. She told the story her whole life to anyone who would listen, to her children and their children, and to a journalist who came to interview her about slavery and Reconstruction when she was 60 years old, sitting in a small house with a fire in the hearth. The journalist wrote everything down, but he didn't include the part about the wolf in his book. He thought people would think she was crazy. But he kept the notes, and years later, after he died, his grandson found them and decided to investigate. He went to Montgomery. He searched through old records, old newspapers, old county reports. He found mentions of the Thornhill fire. He found the newspaper article about the mysterious deaths. He found something else, reports spanning decades. From hunters, from travelers, from people who lived near where the plantation had stood. Reports of a massive black wolf with gold eyes. Seen over 50 years, long past the natural lifespan of any wolf. Seen near communities of formerly enslaved people. Seen attacking men who wore white hoods. Seen near lynching trees, where it would howl through the night until someone came to cut down the bodies. 50 years, long past the life of any wolf. The grandson wrote a book. He called it The Spirit Wolf of Alabama. Some called it fiction, some called it folklore, but the descendants of the people who had lived through it, they knew better. They had their own stories, stories passed down through generations, stories of protection and justice, of a spirit that refused to rest until the wrongs were made right. The ruins of the Thornhill Plantation still exist if you know where to look, overgrown now with trees and brush. The foundation of the main house, bits of the slave quarters, the whipping post, fallen and rotting, but still there. And Alma's grave still marked. People visit it sometimes. They leave flowers. They leave stones. They leave notes thanking her for her strength, for her sacrifice, for holding on when holding on seemed like the most impossible thing in the world. The music quiets to nearly nothing, just a single, sustained note. I want to close with this. The moral of this story is not a simple one. It can't be. History is not simple. Suffering is not simple. And justice, real justice, the kind that comes after lifetimes of waiting, is not simple at all. But if there is a lesson here, I think it is this. Alma believed, for 15 years, that her suffering was meaningless, that Thomas died for nothing, that nothing would ever change. She was wrong. Her suffering had meaning because she survived it, because she bore witness to it, because her survival became the foundation on which 17 people built their first steps toward freedom. She didn't know that when she was lying in the cellar. She couldn't have known, but it was true anyway. James Thornhill believed he was untouchable. He believed his wealth and his power and his position gave him the right to treat human beings as property, to humiliate them, to beat them, to break them, to throw them in holes in the ground. He was wrong, and his wrongness killed him, not dramatically, not poetically, just finally. The way things that have been wrong for long enough eventually become impossible to sustain. And Thomas believed that death was the end, that once they killed him, his story was over. He was the most wrong of all, because death was not the end. It was a transformation. He became something that could not be bought, could not be chained, could not be controlled by any amount of money or power or fear. He became the justice his people could not get from courts or laws or governments that did not see them as people. He became what was needed, and he remained until his purpose was fulfilled. At Ruth's funeral in 1912, her oldest grandson stood and told the story of the Thornhill Plantation. He told it so the youngest generation would know, would remember, would understand the cost of the freedom they had been born into. And when he finished, everyone was silent. And then from somewhere in the distance, from the woods, from the fields, from somewhere beyond where any wolf should have been, a howl rose into the air. Long, mournful, final. People looked at each other. Some smiled, some nodded. They knew what it meant. Thomas had heard. Thomas knew. And Thomas was finally, truly, completely at rest. Some debts must be paid. Some wrongs must be righted. Some justice cannot be denied, no matter how long it takes, no matter what form it takes, no matter who tries to stop it.